What are we doing?
What are we doing? Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. That's what we're doing. And this is for Friday, April 18th, I believe. Yes, April 18th, 2025. That means that Easter is 2 days away. And I, my YouTube feed has several times shown me an ad from a preacher in our state's capital inviting us to Easter service. And then he says, notice I didn't say our Easter service. We'd like you to come to our service, but come to any church that preaches the word and attend an Easter service. Easter services are a big deal. People will go to church on Easter that don't go to church any other day of the year. And churches, what are you saying?
Go?
I doubt it.
I have a date.
At any rate, churches will pull out all the stops to really make a big impression in their Easter services. First time I really became aware of that, I was attending a Baptist church in Colorado, and I happened to attend on Easter Sunday, and they had in students from the local state college music department to play music, and I think they had some singers there from the college too as part of their service. Sometimes churches will put on the selections from the Easter portion of Handel's Messiah. But, they usually make it a really big production, and there'll be people, volunteers for the church, or even employees of the church, who put a lot of the year into planning Easter services. That's just tradition. And that's, people operate on tradition because tradition makes life easier. We know what to expect. We have things to celebrate, and we do it the same way every year, so that there's a routine, and routine helps cut through the complexity of life. Let's put it that way. So we're not saying it's a bad thing. There are people who will get their, how shall I put it, knickers all in a twist because Easter has a lot of pagan roots. For example, the pastor I was telling you about advertised that a number of his campuses had Easter egg hunts for the children. Well, what are the Easter eggs and the chicks and the bunnies all about? Well, they're all about fertility rites. And that was part of the spring celebration amongst pagans that the Church of the Middle Ages adopted in order to smooth the transition of pagan peoples into Christianity. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, that was a terrible thing, they shouldn't have done that. Well, it depends. And just because something has pagan origins doesn't necessarily make it bad. As an example, one of the Christian traditions that has a pagan origin is shaking the pastor's hand at the end of the service. If you're going to get rid of all pagan influence on Christianity, which I don't think you could do, you would have to get rid of that. But a lot of people expect that, and if you don't do it, they're going to be miffed and upset. Anyway, how'd I get off on that? I guess because we were talking about Easter. I was saying, Easter is technically a celebration of Christ's resurrection, which, according to the biblical narrative, happened at Passover. So we know that Jewish celebration took place in the spring. So celebrating Easter in the spring makes sense. The dating that we use doesn't make quite so much sense, since it makes Easter tend to wander around the calendar to make sure it's on Sunday every year, but also related to phases of the moon and so on and so forth. Um, and that phases of the moon thing isn't entirely off, because the Jewish system determined its months by the phases of the moon. So a lot of years, I wouldn't say most years, but a lot of years had 13 months. Most years would have had 12 months, but some of them had 13, because the moon goes through its phases in 28 and some fraction days. And so, yeah, over a couple, 3, 4 years, you're going to end up with an extra month. So using phases of the moon isn't entirely out of it, but the Hebrew calendar determined the beginning of the month by the new moon, whereas Easter is determined by the full moon, which suggests that there may have been some pagan influence in the dating setup. I mean, if we wanted to be as accurate about it as we could, we'd make Easter Sunday the Sunday closest to Jewish Passover, and let the Jews determine when that fell. But yeah, we do what we do, and it isn't terrible that we do it. Our point here in this group is that God is not some, well, shall I use the term HOA Karen, who's particular about all the rules, right down to the least little tenth of an inch kind of thing. That's not what he's like. So I don't personally think he's all that miffed about us including pagan elements in our Easter celebrations, or about us celebrating Easter even if it's kind of on the wrong day. You know, some people make that out to be a big deal. I don't think God is that nitpicky. I just don't think that the character of God revealed in the life and ministry of Jesus fits a description of somebody who's that picky. So
Um, God being nitpicky. I'm thinking of, and I was thinking about this morning. I don't know if I can explain this, but I'm going to try.
okay,
I was thinking about our American history. Are you? My phone dinged. Are you there?
yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I was thinking this morning about slavery and how the slaves believed in a God that they were told they had to believe in, and yet, despite this being forced on them, and despite it being a not so friendly picture of God, a picture of love, that he would allow them to be in slavery, they still found comfort in him.
Yeah,
He reached them at the level that they were functioning.
and we may be able to attribute that to the operation of the Holy Spirit. That God isn't as picky as people make him out to be. He saw people who were in need and who were reaching out to him, and he sent his Spirit to help them understand his character in ways they couldn't have figured out from the information given to them by their owners and masters.
And he's that way with us.
Yeah.
He's that way with people all throughout history.
He lets us believe things about him that are patently false, because at least we now have a connection to him. And he'll work to pull us away from the lies that the enemy has told us about him, oftentimes through our preachers.
Our if our beliefs may be better, may be a better picture of him than what the false, the alternative would be.
Yeah. Hmm.
Anyway, just a thought I had this morning.
I'm checking out our lights because we had light problems this week. Um, we bought this house almost 20 years ago, and it came with a 4 foot 2 bulb fluorescent fixture in the kitchen. Oh, it's nice.
You got a bad dark sucker, so
Yeah. So over the years, I've had to replace bulbs every once in a while in it, and that wasn't a big thing to me. But when the bulbs started going out a little quicker, I began to think, well, maybe I've got a bad ballast. The ballast is, well, the old ballasts were heavy because they included iron core transformer that, you know, created a lot of weight. But they're used to generate the voltage, about 600 volts, and the different voltages necessary to make the light bulb work like it should, and the circuitry to make it start. Because you notice with any fluorescent fixture, even if you get a fast start ballast, you turn the light on, it's going to take about a second before the light actually comes on because there's some things that circuitry has to do. And that can get weak and not work as well over time. So at some point, I went down to the local lumber yard and I bought a new ballast. And it sat on the shelf for several years, I think. But finally, when the bulbs went out on me, rather than just replacing the bulbs, I got up there and I replaced the ballast. And I wired it all in, closed everything up, put the new bulbs in, fired it up, and it worked for well, probably 5 or more years. I don't remember how long. And 2 or 3 years ago, when I was shopping, I happened to look at fluorescent tubes and I saw some LED tubes that are designed to fit into uh, a fluorescent fixture, but they're LED. I thought, well, that sounds like a neat idea. Reduce electricity use, should last longer, so I bought them. Well, then they they sat in the closet for several years after I bought them. Um, Sometime last week, the bulbs in the kitchen started blinking out and not staying on. You turn a light on, they'd come on, then they go back out. Thought, well, it's time to change the bulbs. So I got up there and I took out the regular bulbs and I put in these LED bulbs and I flipped the switch and they came on. They were nice and bright and white and the kitchen was a little bit brighter than before. I thought, well, that's kind of neat. Well, that lasted a day or two. I don't think it was more than 2 days. And all of a sudden, you flip the switch, it'd come on, and then in 3 or 4 or 5 seconds, they'd go back out on
it sucked up all the dark it can handle.
you. Yeah. So I went for several days because I think that was like a week ago today, or a week ago tomorrow, something like that. So I just had to use the kitchen without light because it wasn't working. And so on Monday, when I went out shopping, I went to the same lumber yard and I looked on the shelf and I talked to one of their employees. They didn't have the fluorescent ballast anymore. So I couldn't buy one from there. The other thing I wanted while I was there was stain for our deck. You have to do that every few years or the wood will dry out and rot and become unusable. So you have to keep it stained. And I found the brand that I had been using, but they didn't have it in the color that I was using. So I ended up walking out of that lumber yard without a thing. Didn't pay them a cent. And went about the rest of my shopping. And I checked for a ballast at the Walmart where I do most of my grocery shopping. They didn't have it there. Didn't really expect it, but I thought I'd look. So then the next day, on Tuesday, I went into a nearby larger city where they have a Lowe's, and I went to Lowe's and found a ballast, checked myself out, took the ballast home, put it in, and put the LED bulbs in. I noticed that the ends had gotten dark, but that can happen pretty quickly. That's just kind of the nature of what's going on with 600 volts there and all. So I put them in, flipped the light switch on. One came on and one was flickering and real dim, wasn't really coming on. I turned the switch off, double checked. I hadn't gotten it seated quite properly, so I reseated it, flipped the light switch on. It did exactly the same thing. So now I'm getting frustrated, so I take those out and I put the old bulbs that I had taken out a week earlier almost, put those back in, and it worked. Now, recently, one of those began to flicker and not be as bright, so probably this coming Monday when I go shopping again, I'll buy another couple of fluorescent bulbs, maybe even get four, so I'll have some on the shelf, and
Can I ask you a dumb question?
hopefully that'll work. Yeah, you can ask a dumb question. I don't mind.
Why would you go to a lumber store to buy a piece of electrical hardware?
They have an electrical section. You know, they're for home construction, and they do have an electrical section with conduit and wire and outlets and you know all the things you need to do electrical installations.
Well, I didn't know. Okay.
I'm telling you, they also have plumbing stuff there.
Well,
The bar that I hooked to the wall in front of the toilet to help you get off the toilet,
yeah.
I got that at that lumber yard.
Oh,
So, yeah, you can get all sorts of stuff there, not just lumber. So, at any rate, that's enough yammering for today. We need to get into our Bible study, so let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the blessings of the week that is past, for giving us this week of life, and for helping us to enjoy it even when things don't always go our way. And now we want to take some time to explore the written word. We believe that you had a hand in bringing this to us, and even though it doesn't always create an accurate picture of you, we believe that through the Holy Spirit we can find that accurate picture if we have open minds. So we ask that the minds of the people who hear this presentation will be open to the prompting of the Spirit, and that you will send that Spirit that we might receive a better understanding of who you are. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
before you get started, can you pause and come in here for just a second?
Yeah, just a moment. So, with that taken care of, there was something that I had wanted to mention last week, and it kind of slipped my mind, and then I got started without getting it out this week, but let's go ahead and mention it. We heard somebody last week sometime talking about how humans react to what we in our world call justice. We get kind of a psychic boost out of hearing about people getting their quotes just desserts or karma. You watch dashcam videos, and one of the favorite themes of these dashcam videos is what they call instant karma. Somebody speeds past you, and the next thing you know, there's a car with red and white flashing lights going after them, and a little while later you see them pulled over on the side of the road. And they say that the officer is delivering what they call instant karma or instant justice, whatever. In other words, they get caught doing something wrong. And very often you'll hear a high degree of glee from the people who watch this. They'll laugh and shout with joy and so forth. And there's a reason for that. These things give us a boost, and it has a similar effect that certain drugs have. And so we can end up being addicted to this kind of seeing people get their just desserts, And ultimately, that leads to the normalization and addiction to hating people, because it again stimulates those receptors that are pleasurable receptors. So we get pleasure from it. We want more pleasure. We go after it more. All these stories you find on social media about like HOAs and various forms of delivering justice to obnoxious people, all of those feed that very same need. Unfortunately, it is the same mechanism that leads us to xenophobia and to hating groups of people because they're not us. And we become as addicted to that as we might be to crack or methamphetamine, or nowadays I hear the really potent one is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a legitimate pain-killing medication taken in the right doses, but it can be and often is misused. And so the standard drug tests issued by courts these days include a test for fentanyl. It's kind of funny because it's FENTANYL. That's how it's spelled. But you'll hear people pronounce it as if it ends in OL. Well, an OL ending on a chemical name means it's an alcohol. Fentanyl is not fentanyl. It's not an alcohol. It's a different kind of a drug. But anyway, let's go ahead and switch it up here so we can see our Bible rendition.
Suggesting that the people who are following the Karen Reed trial are addicted to the is drama a good word? Because we're really hating on that Commonwealth.
Well, yeah, the defense lawyer who got hired by the Commonwealth to prosecute the case. Yeah, it's easy to hate him. So yeah, there's probably a lot of people that are getting their kicks out of hating this guy.
It's not just him.
Right.
It's the judge, it's the DA, it's the police department.
It's some of the witnesses who get on the stand and are obviously, as you watch what they say, it's obvious they're lying. So yeah, it can be easy to get our kicks on hating people like this and say that we're hating a behavior, but we have to be careful that we aren't falling into the devil's trap to get us to hate people and thereby fail to love. At any rate, we're ready for 1 Kings chapter 4, and this chapter 4 I expect will go by pretty quickly because it's mostly just names. King Solomon now ruled over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Azariah, son of Zadok, was the priest. We're gonna come up with more on that in a moment. Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, were court secretaries. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, he's the one we've been reading about that's done all the destructive work in establishing Solomon as king. Remember, he's the one that went into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Now, Abiathar, we've already read here in 1 Kings how Solomon deposed him and sent him back to his home and said, "You deserve to die, but you carried the ark of God before my father. I'm not going to kill you, but you can't be priest anymore. Go back home." And apparently he agreed with that, but he's named here anyway. Azariah, son of Nathan, was in charge of the district governors. Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest, was a trusted advisor to the king. Now, is this Nathan, are Azariah and Zabud brothers? Well, it doesn't say they are, it doesn't say they weren't. And is this Nathan the Nathan who was the prophet of God that served David? Well, given the timing of this, I think that's possible. It doesn't say it was, it doesn't say it wasn't. That's just a possibility. Ahishar was manager of the palace property. Adoniram, son of Abda, was in charge of forced labor. Solomon also had 12 district governors who were over all Israel. They were responsible for providing food for the king's household. Each of them arranged provisions for 1 month of the year. These are the names of the 12 governors: Ben-Hur in the hill country of Ephraim, Ben-Decker in Makaz, Shaalbim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon Bethhanan. By the way, that Ben hyphen, that means the son of. That's what the Hebrew means. And a number of these are Ben something. Ben-Hesed in Arubath, including Succo and all the land of Hepher. Ben-Abinadab in all of Naphoth Dor. He was married to Taphath, one of Solomon's daughters. Baana, son of Ahilud, in Tanakh and Megiddo, all of Bethshan near Zarethan below Jezreel, and all the territory from Bethshan to Abel Meholah and over to Jokmeam. Ben-Geber in Ramoth Gilead, including the towns of Jair, named for Jair of the tribe of Manasseh, including Gilead, and in the Argob region of Bashan, including 60 large fortified towns with bronze bars on their gates. Ahinadab, son of Iddo in Mahanaim. Ahimaaz in Naphtali. He was married to Basemath, another of Solomon's daughters. Now, the fact that he's in Naphtali suggests that he's not the Ahimaaz we read about earlier in the story of David's flight from Absalom. But we don't know for sure that he wasn't either. It's just he was in Naphtali and he had this position. He was also a son-in-law like the earlier person. Baana, son of Hushai, and Asher and Aloth. Jehoshaphat, son of Paruah in Issachar. Shimei, son of Elah in Benjamin. Geber, son of Uri in the land of Gilead, including the territories of King Sihon of the Amorites and King Og of Bashan. Now that's the 12. If you weren't counting, there's one verse per person. We started at with 1 in verse 8, and then all the way to verse 19. So there's your 12 right there. And then it says at the end of verse 19, there was also one governor over the land of Judah. And that makes me wonder, I happened to think of this as I was looking at it. Each of these persons was responsible for Solomon's food for 1 month out of the year. But we know that some years had 13 months, as determined by the priests, in order to keep, the first month of the year in line with spring. So, who provided the food then? Well, this may tell us there was also one governor over the land of Judah. So, essentially, Judah was largely exempted from providing food for the king, except in those years when there were 13 months. I don't know. It's just a supposition I make based on what's being told us here and having to imagine what's not being told us. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They were very contented with plenty to eat and drink. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River in the north, or in other words, just the river in the north, to the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt in the south. The conquered peoples of those lands sent tribute money to Solomon and continued to serve him throughout his lifetime. The daily food requirements for Solomon's palace were 150 bushels of choice flour and 300 bushels of meal. Also 10 oxen from the fattening pens, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep or goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roe deer, and choice poultry. Now, that's a lot of food. But Solomon had a large household. We're about to read that he had in the neighborhood of 900 at least wives with children. They had to feed those, plus all the officials that ate at the palace and all the hangers-on who were granted the right to eat at the king's table. So there were a lot of people to feed, and so this is what it took. Solomon's dominion extended over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, from Tishah to Gaza, and there was peace on all his borders. During the lifetime of Solomon, all of Judah and Israel lived in peace and safety. And from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, each family had its own home and garden. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for his chariot horses, and he had 12,000 horses. Now I think that K is going to tell us it might be 40,000 instead of just 4,000. Are you saying something? I thought I heard something.
Yeah. He had all those horses, even though he wasn't supposed to have horses.
You took the words right out of my mouth. And that's why we read what we read last week out of the book of Deuteronomy. He was not supposed to go to Egypt and get horses. He wasn't supposed to get a lot of wives. But here we see him doing exactly those things that Deuteronomy said he wasn't supposed to do. The district governors faithfully provided food for King Solomon and his court. Each made sure nothing was lacking during the month assigned to him. They also brought the necessary barley and straw for the royal horses in the stables. Well, if you got 12,000 horses, or even the footnote will say 12,000 charioteers, that's a lot of horses. They're going to need a lot of provisions. So you gotta. The land was being taxed pretty heavily to provide all this stuff for the king. God gave Solomon his great wisdom and understanding, and knowledge as vast as the sands of the seashore. In fact, his wisdom exceeded that of all the wise men of the East and the wise men of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite and the sons of Mahal, Heman, Calcol, and Darda. I think Heman is mentioned in the Psalms as one of its authors. I'm not positive, but I think that's the case. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. He composed some 3,000 proverbs and wrote 100 or 1,005 songs. He could speak with authority about all kinds of plants, from the great cedar of Lebanon to the tiny hyssop that grows from cracks in a wall. He could also speak about animals, birds, small creatures, and fish. And kings from every nation sent their ambassadors to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. Now, I want to say something about that verse 32 there, where it says he composed some 3,000 proverbs. And of course, we run across those when we get to the book of Proverbs later in the Old Testament. And we understand that while not all of the book was written by Solomon, much of it was. Now, I want to suggest something here, and we'll talk about this again when we get to the book of Proverbs. Recall the importance of the king as the final arbiter of justice, as the one who decided the really hard cases that the lower level judges felt they couldn't decide, or perhaps the people appealed. And I don't like what this judge said. I want somebody else to check it out. Maybe the judge made a mistake and the king can fix it. Of course, it's also possible that the judge got it right and the king will fix it so that it's now wrong. But at any rate, the king was an important role. That is the role that Absalom played on in order to win the hearts of the people when he ultimately rebelled against his father. And that was the element of his job that Solomon felt he needed help with when he had that dream at the high place of, I think it's Gibeon. And so he asked for that. And then the example given in the previous chapter was the case of the two prostitutes and the dead baby. And how he sorted that out, found out who was the mother of the live child and who deserved to have it. So because of the importance of that and the centrality of it to his request for wisdom, and then we think of the Proverbs as exhibiting the wisdom of Solomon, I like to think of the Proverbs as a statement made at the conclusion of a case, expressing the principle that Solomon used to decide the case. So when we do get to the book of Proverbs, one of the things we're going to do is imagine what case might have been brought to the king to elicit this particular proverb. And the one that comes to mind right away, I can't tell you exactly where it's found, but it says, "He who greets his neighbor loudly, rising early in the morning, it'd be counted as a curse." So it sounds to me like somebody was complaining his neighbor was waking him up in the morning, and he wanted him to stop. And the guy's defense was, "Well, I'm saying good things. I'm greeting him. I'm being upbeat and positive." And the king says, "Well, yeah, but if you do it at a loud voice early in the morning, it counts as a curse. Stop it." That's a guess based on what is said in the proverb. And I think that all of the proverbs have their basis in a case that was brought to Solomon. And like I say, it'll be interesting when we get there to examine those in that light. Well, we finished this chapter. You'll notice that some of the footnotes here talk about variants, and some of them talk about what the Hebrew said as opposed to what they translated based on other references. The Greek version reads of Gad there in that case. Hebrew lacks of Judah. The meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Some verses are numbered differently in the Hebrew text, whoop-de-doo. Hebrew says the river, I mentioned that. Then there's the actual Hebrew numbers that are referenced in those. The one reference there says Hebrew, each family lived under its own grapevine and under its own fig tree. And then 40,000 instead of 4,000, and also then the possibility instead of 12,000 horses, it might be charioteers. So we go on to chapter 5. King Hiram of Tyre had always been a loyal friend of David. When Hiram learned that David's son Solomon was the new king of Israel, he sent ambassadors to congratulate him. Then Solomon sent this message back to Hiram. "You know that my father David was not able to build a temple to honor the name of the Lord his God because of the many wars waged against him by surrounding nations. He could not build until the Lord gave him victory over all his enemies." Now, this is a different explanation than the one that we get in Chronicles. In Chronicles, we read that David told Solomon that he couldn't build the temple because God said his hands were covered in blood. And we have pointed to that to suggest that a lot of the stories about what happened in David's reign do not necessarily reflect the character of God, even though the Bible calls David a man after God's own heart, or after his own character. That there were elements of David's character that did not reflect the divine character. But this is a different explanation. This is what is found here in the book of Kings, which was most likely prepared by the same people that prepared the books of Samuel. So they're probably not going to wander far from that approach. Excuse me. "But now the Lord my God has given me peace on every side. I have no enemies, and all is well. So I am planning to build a temple to honor the name of the Lord my God, just as he instructed my father David." Well, actually, he didn't. He didn't tell David to do it. The prophet said, "Oh, you want to do it? Great, sounds good." And then he'd come back and say, "Well, I heard from God overnight. He doesn't want you to do it. Leave it for your son to do." But anyway, that's how he's phrasing it. "For the Lord told him, your son, whom I will place on your throne, will build a temple to honor my name." Well, yeah, he did say that, but anyway. "Therefore, please command that cedars from Lebanon be cut for me. Let my men work alongside yours, and I will pay your men whatever wages you ask. As you know, there is no one among us who can cut timber like you Sidonians." When Hiram received Solomon's message, he was very pleased and said, "Praise the Lord today for giving David a wise son to be king of the great nation of Israel." Probably mostly fluff and flattery, but it gets you places in this world. You were going to say something?
I want to interrupt you for a moment. Do you suppose the reason that David wasn't fit to build the temple? David was known as the man who was the man after God's own heart, but isn't the temple supposed to be a representation of God's character?
Yes.
So, and David was the man after God's own heart, yet he wasn't qualified to build the temple. Why do you suppose that was?
Well, like I say, the book of Chronicles says it was because of all the blood he shed, that he was a man of war.
Yeah, he had no problem with killing people. And God doesn't kill. God's not a murderer.
There may have been other reasons as well,
I
but
don't even recognize that. That you don't kill people.
well, he was a man of his culture and place in the world,
Yeah.
but that's not necessarily reflective of God,
Right.
because this world is steeped in sin.
He didn't have a problem with killing other humans or anybody or anything. And how could he be qualified to build a representation of God's character when he's not aware that taking life is wrong?
Well, the question is, was Solomon that much better in that respect? Granted, he was not a man of war like his father because he had peace, but we read how he got himself named king, and that included having his brother killed, having the former army commander killed, and eventually having the man who'd cursed his father also killed.
And he when he gets the Lord's command and got all those horses, and look at how many wives he had.
Yeah.
He was not a nice man.
Yeah, unfortunately, you add wisdom and knowledge
But was
to
that,
human depravity, you've got a big problem.
was that self-proclaimed wisdom and knowledge, or was it actual fact?
Well, the people of the time seemed to recognize it because they sent their ambassadors to hear him.
Well, why would they do that? Was he not boasting about how wise and wonderful he was?
Well, it was probably a certain element of self-promotion taking place.
There used to be somebody, he is now deceased, but he claimed to be the greatest. And he bragged about how he was the greatest, and he had a lot of followers.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be mean to the man. I don't know him, never met him. I worked with his housekeeper for a while. So I knew a little bit of the things that were going on in his home. I know that his wife loved him. But was he the greatest? Being a self-proclaimed anything, you need to live up to that. If you have to, it's like these politicians out there, vote for me because I'm better than so-and-so. Well, that in itself disqualifies you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I believe in all this wisdom of Solomon. Was it real, or was it delusion on his part, and he had the charisma to delude the world and people who lived thereafter?
Well, I do think that he had a pretty keen insight into human nature that allowed him to make just decisions in the cases brought to him, as exemplified in the case of the two prostitutes.
Well, yeah.
And that was,
Make that call.
but that, like anything that we have, is ultimately a gift from the Creator. The Creator made us, and He made us in a certain way to have certain skills and capabilities. So everything that we can do, even if it's innate and inherent in our birth, is still attributable to the Creator who made us.
Yeah, He gives everybody their own set of gifts and talent.
No.
Being good at one thing doesn't mean you're good at the other thing. Automatically.
Yeah.
And just because your neighbor can do something doesn't mean that you can.
No. I was watching an ad for some.
I'm not going to say he wasn't a wise ruler, but he did some pretty foolish things to have been as wise as he claimed to be.
I was seeing an ad earlier that included some acrobatic performances, and they showed a guy running along the mats and jumping and flipping as he was jumping and sliding through a hoop that was moving as he was running and jumping. Okay, he can do it. Does that mean I could do it? I'm 70. No, I'm not going to try it. But anyway.
I don't see you try.
Huh?
I don't want to see you try.
Yeah.
You're 70.
Well, anyway, let's continue on here. We just read verse 7 of 1 Kings 5. So Hiram said this, "Praise the Lord today for giving David a wise son to be king of the great nation of Israel," which I suggested was a lot of fluff and flattery, but flattery will get you everywhere in this world. And then he sent this reply to Solomon: "I have received your message, and I will supply all the cedar and cypress timber you need. My servants will bring the logs from the Lebanon mountains to the Mediterranean Sea and make them into rafts and float them along the coast to whatever place you choose. Then we will break the rafts apart so you can carry the logs away. You can pay me by supplying me with food for my household." And this is kind of expressing the fundamentals of trade. Trade done properly can help everybody have a better life. Lebanon and the region of Sidon and of Tyre, these places were rich in timber. Israel was rich in agricultural land that could produce crops well, and where they could raise animals. And so the trade says Lebanon or Tyre trades what it has an abundance of, namely high quality lumber, in exchange for what Israel had an abundance of, namely food. And so the people in Tyre live better because there's more food, and the people in Israel live better because they have better lumber. And when done properly, trade can take advantage of the strengths of each region and help everybody to have a better life than they could have without said trade. Of course, then you can get into all the political implications and all the stuff that goes on, but that's just humans being, well, I won't call them what they are, but being toxic and negative.
They're being human.
Huh?
They're being human.
Yeah. So Hiram supplied as much cedar and cypress timber as Solomon desired. In return, Solomon sent him an annual payment of 100,000 bushels of wheat for his household and 110,000 gallons of pure olive oil. So the Lord gave wisdom to Solomon just as he had promised, and Hiram and Solomon made a formal alliance of peace. Then King Solomon conscripted a labor force of 30,000 men from all Israel. He sent them to Lebanon in ships, 10,000 every month, so that each man would be 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of this labor force. Solomon also had 70,000 common laborers, 80,000 quarry workers in the hill country, and 3,600 foremen to supervise the work. At the king's command, they carried large blocks of high quality stone and shaped them to make the foundation of the temple. Men from the city of Gebal helped Solomon and Hiram's builders prepare the timber and stone for the temple. And then the footnotes here, the different numberings of in the Hebrew text, which again I don't think means anything. Hebrew says the sea rather than the Mediterranean. They lived in a narrower worldview. The whole thing of there being an Atlantic and a Pacific and an Antarctic Ocean on top of the Mediterranean Sea wasn't a big obvious part of their worldview. The sea, that was all that water out there on our western boundary. Then the actual numbers here for the amount of food Solomon supplied to Hiram, and some Greek manuscripts see also 2 Chronicles 22, 2 and 18. The Hebrew reads 3,300 instead of 3,600. Again, so what? Chapter 6. It was in mid-spring, in the month of Ziv, during the 4th year of Solomon's reign, that he began to construct the temple of the Lord. This was 480 years after the people of Israel were rescued from their slavery in the land of Egypt. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The entry room at the front of the temple was 30 feet wide, running across the entire width of the temple. It projected outward 15 feet from the front of the temple. Solomon also made narrow recessed windows throughout the temple. Now, the footnotes down there are going to convert all that to what the Hebrew says, which is a certain number of cubits. The Hebrew was 60 cubits, 20 cubits, and 30 cubits.
Hello.
Hmm?
Hello.
Hello what?
I just remembered what it was that I was wanting to say a while ago, and I got off on the wrong subject.
What was that?
Well, back to David not being able to build the temple. I'm just wondering why. What was it about the temple that disqualified David from building it? My thoughts are going along the lines of his hands are too bloody to build it. Why? Was he allowed to do it? What was the difference between him and Solomon? Well, could it be that God didn't want David to build it because he didn't understand how to plan it to make it represent his character? And yet, even though he was told that he was not the one to build it, he planned it and provided all of the material for it, including the blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving the work for Solomon to oversee. So who actually built the thing?
Well, it's those 30,000 forced laborers.
Yeah.
And that's a criticism that has been laid against how Solomon handled it, because by using forced laborers, then he deprived the people in general of the opportunity to put their own effort into building this house for God.
But he was wise enough to know what he was doing, wasn't he? I mean, he was so full of wisdom, and there go getting off on that again. No, my point is about the planning of it. Why did David think it was all right to plan it and provide for it, provide the materials, right down to even the blueprints, and get handed over to Solomon acceptable when he had been told he was not to be the one to build it?
Well, who knows how people think? Who knows what was in his mind? But a lot of times, you get told you can't do something. Well, you go as far as you think you can get away with toward doing it anyway, as long as you don't actually do it, and you hope you can bluff your way through if you get called to account for what you've done.
Kind of like a cat.
That's just human nature.
Kind of like our cat. It's okay as long as mommy or daddy don't see me.
Yeah, like getting up on the kitchen counter.
Yeah.
Well, at any rate, let's continue on. By the way, you kind of made me remember this. I used to work at a radio station that played Southern gospel music. And way back near the beginning of my time working there, which was more years ago than I care to tell you, one of the Southern gospel groups came out with a song titled Solomon's Temple or David's Harp, suggesting that the ostentation and display of Solomon's temple actually did not lead to the worship of God in the way that David's simple harp playing did. And that makes me think that there's a possibility that all the excessive wealth that Solomon put into building this structure, making it magnificent and attractive the world around, may have misled all worshipers of the Creator in the future to think that God wanted all this ostentatious display, to the point where the church in the Dark Ages would impoverish the people so that it could build cathedrals that were, I mean, look at them today, they're just extremely ornate and detailed and involved a lot of social resources that could have gone to better use in other ways. And maybe that's kind of part of God's reluctance about this whole building a thing is. He says, I've lived in a tent. I'm okay with that. You don't need to do this. But they wanted to do it anyway. And maybe God honored the purity of their intent, even if he had problems with the execution and the results for all time thereafter on this earth.
Well, I think here, let me say this, that if you find your happiness in opulence and wealth, you're basing your happiness upon something that doesn't last. Your happiness is based upon selfishness. If you base your happiness upon helping others, like I remember when I was working as a teacher's aide, and when I would work with a child and be able to see the look on the child's face when the child was able to grasp the concept that he had difficulty with, I didn't get paid for that by wealth, physical wealth. My joy came in the happiness that the kid was actually pleased that he had accomplished what he needed to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's the the act of reaching out and helping others where we find our happiness, our true happiness, not in opulence and wealth. Yet the temple was built with all kinds of opulence and wealth. And here I'm being redundant.
Yeah.
Opulence and wealth. O-W. O-A-W.
The entrance to the bottom floor was on the south side of, oh, wait a minute. I didn't go up quite far enough. So we were talking about the dimensions. Now the dimensions are similar, although the tabernacle, the tent structure, the portable structure that Moses erected in the wilderness, that was 10 cubits wide, 30 cubits long, and 10 cubits high. It's the same dimensions. Now we're talking about 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide. Yeah. But then it was 15 cubits high. No, 15, be more than that. It was a little bit higher than it was wide, which was a little bit different. Otherwise, the general dimensions were in the same proportions, just a lot bigger. The entry room at the front of the temple was 30 feet wide, or in other words, 20 cubits. Running across the entire width of the temple, it projected outward 15 feet, or 10 cubits, from the front of the temple. Solomon also made narrow recessed windows throughout the temple. He built a complex of rooms against the outer walls of the temple, all the way around the sides and rear of the building. This complex was 3 stories high, the bottom floor being 7.5 feet wide, the second floor 9 feet wide, and the top floor 10.5 feet wide. Now that makes for a kind of inverted structure where it's wider at the top than it is at the bottom. So that took certain construction skills to make that work and be solid. The rooms were connected to the walls of the temple by beams resting on ledges built out from the wall, so the beams were not inserted into the walls themselves. That's fascinating. How they fastened that, I'm not sure, but they made it work somehow. The stones used in the construction of the temple were finished at the quarry, so there was no sound of hammer, axe, or any other iron tool at the building site. And that was, I guess, Solomon's idea of how to show respect and reverence to the Creator by not making it noisy at the construction site. The entrance to the bottom floor was on the south side of the temple. There were winding stairs going up to the second floor and another flight of stairs between the second and third floors. After completing the temple structure, Solomon put in a ceiling made of cedar beams and planks. As already stated, he built a complex of rooms along the sides of the building, attached to the temple walls by cedar timbers. Each story of the complex was 7.5 feet, or 5 cubits high. Then the Lord gave this message to Solomon. Concerning this temple you are building, if you keep all my decrees and regulations and obey all my commands, I will fulfill through you the promise I made to your father, David. I will live among the Israelites and will never abandon my people Israel. Then it goes on to talk about the temple's interior. So Solomon finished building the temple. The entire inside, from floor to ceiling, was paneled with wood. He paneled the walls and ceilings with cedar, and he used planks of cypress for the floors. He partitioned off an inner sanctuary, the most holy place, at the far end of the temple. It was 30 feet deep and was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. The main room of the temple outside the most holy place was 60 feet long, or 40 cubits. Cedar paneling completely covered the stone walls throughout the temple, and the panel was decorated with carvings of gourds and open flowers. He prepared the inner sanctuary at the far end of the temple where the Ark of the Lord's covenant would be placed. This inner sanctuary was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high. So it's a cubic in structure. And it is twice the dimensions of the original of the tent temple that Moses built, which means that its volume was 4 times as much. He prepared the inner sanctuary at the far end of the temple where the Ark of the Lord's covenant would be placed. We read that. He overlaid the inside with solid gold. He also overlaid the altar made of cedar. Then Solomon overlaid the rest of the temple's interior with solid gold, and he made gold chains to protect the entrance to the most holy place. So he finished overlaying the entire temple with gold, including the altar that belonged to the most holy place. Now, that altar was probably one that he built to replace the altar of incense. The only thing, as we can tell, that actually comes from the original tent or portable temple was the Ark of the Covenant, which in their minds had mystical capabilities and powers. And so in the minds of people today, we still think of it as having some certain mystical powers, even though we don't know where it is. So he finished overlaying the entire temple with gold, including the altar that belonged to the most holy place. And that idea of the altar of incense belonging to the most holy place we find in the book of Hebrews, though not necessarily in Exodus, where it describes how Moses built it. But this reference here suggests that that wasn't a new idea that the author of Hebrews suggests, placing the altar of incense in the most holy place, or at least belonging to it. He made 2 cherubim of wild olive wood, each 15 feet tall, and placed them in the inner sanctuary. The wingspan of each of the cherubim was 15 feet, each wing being 7.5 feet long. So the total would be the 30 feet, the width of the chamber. The 2 cherubim were identical in shape and size. Each was 15 feet tall. He placed them side by side in the inner sanctuary of the temple. Their outspread wings reached from wall to wall, while their inner wings touched at the center of the room. He overlaid the 2 cherubim with gold. Now, these reflected the cherubim that were carved into the mercy seat, or the gold covering of the Ark of the Covenant. So now we had them represented there on the ark, and also in larger form inside that room. He decorated all the walls of the inner sanctuary and the main room with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid the floor in both rooms with gold. You wonder where he got all that gold. There was probably more gold in the world back then than there is now. Who knows? For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made double doors of olive wood with 5-sided doorposts. These double doors were decorated with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The doors, including the decorations of cherubim and palm trees, were overlaid with gold. Then he made 4-sided doorposts of wild olive wood for the entrance to the temple. There were 2 folding doors of cypress wood, and each door was hinged to fold back upon itself. These doors were decorated with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, all overlaid evenly with gold. The walls of the inner courtyard were built so that there was 1 layer of cedar beams between every 3 layers of finished stone. The foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in mid-spring in the month of Ziv during the 4th year of Solomon's reign. The entire building was completed in every detail by mid-autumn in the month of Bul during the 11th year of his reign. So 4 to 11, 7.5 years it took to finish this. It says 7 years to build the temple, but of course we're going from spring to fall, another half year there. And I'll look at my clock and suppose we have time for another chapter, so let's just go ahead and go to it. Solomon also built a palace for himself, and it took him 13 years to complete the construction. Now, David had already built a palace using cedar from Tyre, but now Solomon builds one for himself on top of the one, not literally, but in addition to the one that his father had built. One of Solomon's buildings was called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. Well, it was probably built with wood from the forests of Lebanon, so that made sense. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. There were 4 rows of cedar pillars, and great cedar beams rested on the pillars. The hall had a cedar roof. Above the beams on the pillars were 45 side rooms arranged in tiers of 15 each. On each end of the long hall were 3 rows of windows facing each other. All the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames and were arranged in sets of 3 facing each other.
I want to be a tree hugger here. Actually cut down the entire forest to build that thing?
We don't know. One would think that. I didn't hear that.
It sounds like it. That's a lot of wood.
Yeah, well, wood grows. It'll replace itself. One would imagine that Hiram didn't get where he was by being stupid, and he would presumably have had the wisdom to practice sustainable forestry in harvesting the timber that he sent to Solomon.
I hope so.
Yeah. Solomon also built the Hall of Pillars, which was 75 feet long and 45 feet wide. There was a porch in front, along with a canopy supported by pillars. Solomon also built the throne room, known as the Hall of Justice, where he sat to hear legal matters. It was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. Solomon's living quarters surrounded a courtyard behind this hall, and they were constructed the same way. He also built similar living quarters for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. So he wasn't supposed to go to Egypt to get horses. Not only did he go to Egypt to get horses, he went to Egypt to get a wife.
Cool.
Anyway.
What else can we do to thumb our nose at the Lord?
Who knows?
Start following their idol?
Well, there is the indication that, in fact, he did.
Yeah. He was wise, wasn't he?
Wise did not always mean spiritually astute or faithful to the Creator.
So wise he acted stupidly.
Sometimes, yeah. From foundation to eaves, all these buildings were built from huge blocks of high-quality stone, cut with saws and trimmed to exact measure on all sides. Some of the huge foundation stones were 15 feet long, and some were 12 feet long. The blocks of high-quality stone used in the walls were also cut to measure, and cedar beams were also used. The walls of the great courtyard were built so that there was 1 layer of cedar beams between every 3 layers of finished stone, just like the walls of the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple with its entry room. And I'm imagining what that looked like, 3 rows of stone, a row of wood, 3 rows of stone, a row of wood. There was probably some aesthetic feature to this design that made it pleasing. It was pleasing to the eyes to see it this way. And he used this as a sort of motif in all his buildings so that they all had similar design and, fit together. When you came to Jerusalem to see the capital of Israel, you would see these buildings all matching, and it would be aesthetically pleasing, and it would be something to boast about.
Well, when I'm building furrow field, I do that.
Well, you do stone outside of wood. Yeah.
I do 2 layers of stone with 1 layer of wood inside to make it look like wood inside, but on the outside, you need the strength of the stone that the wood just doesn't give you.
Right.
The safety is involved in that.
Yeah, because it wards off the attacks of all the buggers that come after you.
Yeah. Oh,
If you don't recognize this, she's talking about the game Dragon Quest Builders 2. And the first place that you are sent to work in that game is the farm island at Furrowfield.
it's a builder game.
Yeah. It's kind of a cross between
RPG and a builder.
RPG and a game like Minecraft. So there's some story to it. It's not just a place for you to build and raise animals and farm and all those things that you can do in Minecraft. There's a story that you follow along with all that. And then when the story's over, you get to keep building for as long as you want. And there are people, a lot of people actually, who have played the game and who have gotten highly creative, and you see a pretty high level of skill in design that they're able to put into building structures in their virtual world. It's interesting what people will put their minds to. Anyway. Reading on then, King Solomon then asked for a man named Hiram to come from Tyre. He was half Israelite, since his mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father had been a craftsman in bronze from Tyre. Hiram was extremely skillful and talented in any work in bronze, and he came to do all the metalwork for King Solomon. Hiram cast 2 bronze pillars, each 27 feet tall and 18 feet in circumference, which would give you a radius of, let's see, of about 3 feet roughly. Is that right? Two pi r is the circumference, so you'd have to divide the 18 by 6, which gets you 3, yeah, approximately. So it was 6 feet thick, roughly. For the tops of the pillars, he cast bronze capitals, each 7.5 feet tall. Each capital was decorated with 7 sets of latticework and interwoven chains. He also encircled the latticework with 2 rows of pomegranates to decorate the capitals over the pillars. The capitals on the columns inside the entry room were shaped like water lilies, and they were 6 feet tall. The capitals on the 2 pillars had 200 pomegranates in 2 rows around them, beside the rounded surface next to the latticework. Hiram set the pillars at the entrance of the temple, one toward the south and one toward the north. He named the one on the south Jachin and the one on the north Boaz. Jachin and Boaz do come up in descriptions later, and there is symbolism that goes with these two, with these names as well. The capitals on the pillars were shaped like water lilies, and so the work on the pillars was finished. And when I say that about Jachin and Boaz, I'm drawing on a class I took in college, however many gazillion years ago that was, which studied the elements of the sanctuary. And the professor did make quite a bit about this Jachin and Boaz and the symbolism of it, and pointing out how that was drawn in some degree from the culture of Egypt. Then Hiram cast a great round basin, 15 feet across from rim to rim, called the Sea. It was 7.5 feet deep and about 45 feet in circumference. It was encircled just below its rim by 2 rows of decorative gourds. There were about 16 gourds per foot all the way around, and they were cast as part of the basin. The Sea was placed on a base of 12 bronze oxen, all facing outward. 3 faced north, 3 faced west, 3 faced south, and 3 faced east, and the Sea rested on them. The walls of the Sea were about 3 inches thick, and its rim flared out like a cup and resembled a water lily blossom. It could hold about 11,000 gallons of water. And this, of course, is the equivalent in Solomon's temple to the laver in the tent temple. Hiram also made 10 bronze water carts, each 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet tall. They were constructed with side panels braced with crossbars. Both the panels and the crossbars were decorated with carved lions, oxen, and cherubim. Above and below the lions and oxen were wreath decorations. Each of these carts had 4 bronze wheels and bronze axles. There were supporting posts for the bronze basins at the corners of the carts. These supports were decorated on each side with carvings of wreaths. The top of each cart had a rounded frame for the basin. It projected 1.5 feet above the cart's top like a round pedestal, and its opening was 2.25 feet across. Excuse me. It was decorated on the outside with carvings of wreaths. The panels of the carts were square, not round. Under the panels were 4 wheels that were connected to axles that had been cast as one unit with the cart. The wheels were 2.25 feet in diameter and were similar to chariot wheels. The axles, spokes, rims, and hubs were all cast from molten bronze. There were handles at each of the 4 corners of the carts, and these too were cast as one unit with the cart. Around the top of each cart was a rim 9 inches wide. The corner supports and side panels were cast as one unit with the cart. Carvings of cherubim, lions, and palm trees decorated the panels and corner supports wherever there was room, and there were wreaths all around. All 10 water carts were the same size and were made alike, for each was cast from the same mold. Now, I never was really aware of this. I've read through this who knows how many times. Somehow it never dawned on me to see that he had made 12 water carts. And maybe that's because in other versions it doesn't call them carts. Let me just look at my NIV here and read that and see what it says. Because the NIV is the one I've read the most. Okay, yeah, the NIV just calls it 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 40 cubits across. 4 cubits across, rather. 1 basin to go on each of the 10 stands. So it talks about the stands and then the basins on the stands. This calls it carts because there were wheels. Yeah, axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all of cast metal. So the idea was there somehow it just never clicked that these were portable stands for these smaller water basins. There were handles at each of the 4 corners of the carts, and these 2 were cast as one unit with the cart. Around the top of each cart was a rim 9 inches wide. The corner supports and side panels were cast as one unit with the cart. Okay. All 10 water carts were the same size and were made alike, for each was cast in the same mold. Hiram also made 10 smaller bronze basins, 1 for each cart. Each basin was 6 feet across and could hold 220 gallons of water. He set 5 water carts on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north side. The great bronze basin called the sea was placed near the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the necessary wash basins, shovels, and bowls. So at last Hiram completed everything King Solomon had signed him to make for the temple of the Lord: the two pillars, the two bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the two networks of interwoven chains that decorated the capitals, the 400 pomegranates that hung from the chains on the capitals, 2 rows of pomegranates for each of the chain networks that decorated the capitals on top of the pillars, the 10 water carts holding the 10 basins, the sea and 12 oxen under it, the ash buckets, the shovels, and the bowls. So a lot of stuff made out of bronze, utensils for the daily operations of this temple. Hiram made all these things of burnished bronze. In other words, they cast it and then they polish it to make it look bright. For the temple of the Lord, just as King Solomon had directed, the king had them cast in clay molds in the Jordan Valley between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon did not weigh all these things because there were so many. The weight of the bronze could not be measured. A lot of bronze. Solomon also made all the furnishings of the temple of the Lord: the gold altar, the gold table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of solid gold, 5 on the south and 5 on the north. It's a little bit different than in the original design. In front of the most holy place, the flower decorations, lamps and tongs, all of gold. The small bowls, lamp snuffers, bowls, ladles, and incense burners, all of solid gold. The doors for the entrance to the most holy place and the main room of the temple, with their fronts overlaid with gold. So King Solomon finished all his work on the temple of the Lord. Then he brought all the gifts his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the various articles, and he stored them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. And thus we have a description of an exceptionally ornate building built of extremely precious materials with all the gold, but even the silver and the bronze. And then all this wealth, in addition, added to the treasuries of the Lord's temple. Treasuries that we will read later get raided by future kings trying to bail themselves out of trouble. And of course, there's a whole lot of footnotes here, mostly about how they're converting the measurements from what's said in the Hebrew to English measurements that people like us in the United States can understand. And based on the time and the fact that we've reached the end of another chapter, I think this is probably a good place for us to stop. And hopefully we're done with this. We're going to read next about the ceremony that dedicates this thing, and we'll have similarly skeptical views of what's said there, even though some of what's said in that ceremony has become a well-known wordings out of the Bible. Are you still there? Did you go to sleep?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I kind of got lost.
Well, it's easy to get lost with all that description and without pictures to go with it. Yeah, it's kind of dry.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm wondering, how does this represent the character and show his love for us?
Well,
That's supposed to be the focus of this group.
there is a book written, possibly almost a century ago now, by someone named Oswald Chambers, My Utmost for His Highest, suggesting that what we dedicate to the Creator should be the best that we can provide. Now, there is symbology in that we should put our very best efforts, the best of our intelligence, the best of our skills toward the service of our Creator, in part through service to our fellow humans. And where this ideology and this symbology kind of falls apart is then we're taking value and social resources that could be utilized toward improving the lives of our fellow humans and addressing them toward display and ostentation. Look at what a wonderful thing I've built for God. And we question if that's really pleasing to the Creator, or if He accepts our service and cries about the damage that we do when we think we're serving Him.
Oh man,
And there was something.
for what I have done.
Yeah. There was something that you and I discussed earlier, because we were discussing that court case going on out in Massachusetts. Opening statements are supposed to begin next Tuesday, I think it is.
Yeah.
And a lot of us believe that the woman accused of murdering this man is being framed, that it wasn't her that did it at all. And we believe that the evidence is quite clear that she can't have done it, at least the way they said she did it. And we get upset at the prosecutors and the judges because we think they're displaying bias and corruption. And my wife pointed something out. We get this upset about what's going on there in Massachusetts. But look at all the injustice that's happened in this world. How do you think God feels about that? And that brought to my mind a quotation. I won't talk a lot about the origin of it because I'm not clear about the origin of it other than where I learned it from, and I'm not sure that's entirely valid. But the statement is this: the cross, the place where Jesus was executed, is but a dim revelation to our dull senses of the pain which, from its very inception, sin has caused to the heart of God. All these terrible things that we read about here in the Old Testament, all the executions and murders, all the war and fighting, all the torture that people are inflicting on each other. God is a God of empathy. And so you do it to them, you do it to Him. That's what Jesus said in the parable of the sheep and the goats. When did we do all these things? And Jesus said, well, to the extent that you've done it to the least of these brothers of mine, you've done it to me. So when we abuse our fellow humans, we abuse our Creator. He feels it. And He endures that pain in order to redeem us. He could end us just like that. He doesn't. And that's what's so amazing about His character. And now we got into that and we've run over a little bit.
It was this week. I was watching some of the motions that had come down. You came in the room, and I told you what was going on, and I was upset and yelling. And when you heard it, you started throwing a tantrum as well. And then I stopped and I said, look at how we're acting.
Yeah.
We are having a physical reaction in our bodies to what we're witnessing in that courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's affecting us. How many people, this trial is now worldwide, and there are people out there experiencing the same thing that we're feeling. We only experience it for ourselves. God experiences it for a long not just us, but everybody else that's out there watching and experiencing the same thing we're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's mind blowing that he has to handle all that, and he knows the truth. And he knows that every time that prosecuting attorney opens his mouth, his nose grows.
Yeah.
Everything he says practically is a lie. And the judge knows it. She has to know it. She's been sitting there the whole time. Oh man, see, I'm getting upset again. Listen
Yeah.
to this.
Well, maybe we need to just call it off for tonight and tell everybody that we're glad you joined us, and I hope that you'll join us again next week, and we'll continue through First Kings. And until then, we say,
One more thing.
make it,
Karen, she needs your prayers. Trial starts Tuesday on murder charges, which she has already been found not guilty. She's facing double jeopardy.
yeah. Well, at any rate, like I say, until next week, we do say goodbye and God bless.
Happy weekend.